Hello and welcome to the Political Opinions podcast, where every opinion is given equal footing and political tolerance and debate are given their proper attention in a world where both are on the decline. Today's episode will cover different opinions on university tuition fees. Tuition fees are essentially any cost paid by a student regarding the education side of their university experience. They were first introduced by Tony Blair in 1998 and have since risen in cost and prominence. Tuition fees are widely hated for the burden they place on students. There are those, however, who believe that tuition fees are either good and or necessary. Today, we will unpick and compare these opinions. The first and perhaps main reason why people support tuition fees is that university degrees can be seen as an investment. A degree is very sought after by an employer, with graduates often earning far more on average than those who do not have a degree. And because university degrees are an investment for the future, some claim therefore it is wrong to have it provided for free, and if students want to go, they should have to pay for it. On this point again, there's a question of why should the taxpayer fund the education of students when they can pay for it themselves. Students make the choice to go to university, and as such, they should be the ones to pay for it themselves. There's also a view that tuition fees are fair because everyone pays the same amount. Richer people should not have to pay more for the same education as poorer people to some, and if tuition is free, that is in effect what they are doing, on the basis that they are paying more tax, and taxes are funding the education. With everyone paying the same amount, therefore, some argue it is fairer. There is also a view that many students will earn far more than they would have otherwise earned without a degree, and as such, a degree will pay for itself. Furthermore, after a set period of time, the government will write off any debt that has not been paid back by a student, meaning that there will not be a burden on them for the rest of their life. And furthermore, it also teaches people essential skills about money management that they would not otherwise possess. And as such, some argue that tuition fees are both beneficial to students in this way, and that they are not as heavy a burden as some would claim. Then on the question of where does the money come from? To put it simply, tuition is expensive, and the cost is only going to go up with increased costs of technology and online subscriptions. The government simply cannot afford to fund university for every student, and given that increasing numbers of people every year are going to university, that incapable cost is simply going to increase. There's also a view that tuition fees help by rationing degrees and mean they maintain their value. If everyone in the country has a degree, then the value of a university bachelor's degree will fall, which is harmful for the future. Furthermore, there are often, currently at least, more graduates than graduate jobs, and as such, if we make university free and allow more people to go, then this problem will only get worse. And finally, some argue that universities are better off with tuition fees because it provides them with more financial resources to create better education and research. Universities get more money from tuition than they would, likely, if the government were funding it. This means they are able to provide a higher class of teaching and research, which is beneficial both for the students, the researchers, and the wider implications that research often has, for example, developing new medicines. Now, for those who oppose university tuition, the first point to make is that they believe university education to be a necessity. Almost every high-paying job today requires a bachelor's degree at a minimum, and this therefore means that it is unfair to expect students to have to take on debt just to have a chance at being successful in the future. Then on this point of rich people and whether or not it's fair for them, well, some argue that tuition fees are unfair because richer people are either able to pay off the debt early on, avoid the burden of the debt by being able to have more money to pay it off, or avoid the debt altogether by just paying the cost up front. This therefore creates an unequal society, while those who are born into money have a head start because they avoid the 9% tax, essentially, that tuition fees are once you're trying to pay it off, and the wider financial burden of having it to begin with. Similar to this, free tuition would allow more students from disadvantaged backgrounds to enter university and therefore have better future prospects. This has the benefit of improving social mobility and prevents a system where only those who are already born into money can afford to get a degree and make more money in the future. There's also a view that students are left with high burdens for the debt. Students are left with thousands of pounds of debt that they have to pay back over almost their entire working life. The interest on loans is incredibly high, and as such, paying for university is placing a financial burden that will last for decades on younger people and make their lives even harder. Furthermore, although tuition fees are expensive for the government to cover, some suggest that it will actually pay for itself in time. With more graduates, you will have a more skilled and higher earning workforce. This means that in the future, they will likely be paying for more income tax, increasing the government's revenue. And it's a common kind of Keynesian economic argument that you pay for it now and it will pay for itself in the long run with more economic growth, higher paying jobs, and therefore higher income and higher taxes. This point is linked to the idea that free tuition allows more people to attend university. With more people going, some argue society will be better off. The country will be able to specialise in more high-tech economic sectors than if the university experience was rationed to only a few who could afford it. And then finally, some argue that universities are now more focused on making money and increasing student numbers than providing a good degree of education for students. They have argued that by making students pay for university, it has turned the university into a money-making machine rather than a centre for education and learning. Moving on now to the comparison. Firstly, on the question of is a degree choice or necessity. Those supporting tuition fees argue it is a choice to go to university. It is an investment you make for your future and therefore you should have to pay for it. However, those disagreeing argue that degrees are essential for modern society and people should not be deterred or prevented from going because of the cost. Then on the impact on equality. Those supporting tuition fees argue that tuition fees are equal because it makes everyone pay the same amount, and no one should ever have to pay more for the same education. However, those disagreeing argue that tuition fees harm equality by making it harder for poor people to succeed, and richer people find it far easier to go to university and thus go in much higher numbers. On the impact for the government, some argue that tuition fees are so expensive that the government cannot afford it. It simply is not practical, and as such we need tuition fees to relieve that burden. Those disagreeing, however, argue that in time, tuition fees will pay for itself. With a smarter and more skilled population, there will be more money, therefore more taxes, and it will all come full circle. On the impact on the economy and society, those supporting tuition fees argue that if too many students go to university because it's now free, this will in turn degrade the value of a degree, which reduces the positive impact of graduates on society. Those disagreeing, however, argue that more students will only be a good thing. With a better educated and skilled workforce for the future, there are a few drawbacks to this in their view. Then, on the impact on students, those supporting tuition fees argue that students earn far more money with a degree and may even pay off their debt. They also learn the importance of financial management, and as such, the debt incurred is not that bad. However, those disagreeing argue that tuition fees leave students with very high levels of debt, which place an unfair burden on them for the future. And finally, on the impact of universities, those supporting tuition fees argue that it gives universities access to more resources and more money, meaning in turn they can provide better research and better education, which again has knock-on effects. However, those disagreeing would say that tuition fees have made universities entirely focused on money, which have resulted in declines in standards of teaching and learning, and in turn degrade the entire value of universities, making them no longer centres of learning, but rather centres of making more money. Overall then, those who support tuition fees believe that they maintain the value of degrees without being detrimental to students or society. Those opposing them, however, argue that they prevent social mobility and are unequal, given they make it harder for poorer people to get a degree, which is essential for modern society. With ever increasing numbers of students, it looks as if university tuition is here to stay. We will have to wait and see whether so many people going to university will be a good or bad thing for the future. Ultimately though, what do you think? Do you think that university tuition fees are good or bad, and should we have entirely free tuition, selectively free, and so on? Also, is there anything that I missed, got wrong, or could do better? Let me know in the comments or on Twitter. As always, the aim of this episode has been not to try and argue for or against one side of the debate, but rather to highlight the different opinions on the topic and provide a comparison between them. Be sure to check back on Monday for another episode. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you all soon.